July 18, 2025. Before dawn broke over the Philippine Sea, the calm was shattered by a storm of steel and fire. From the deck of the Chinese aircraft carrier, Liu Yang01, 12 YJ-21E hypersonic cruise missiles and more than 20 electronic warfare drones surged into the sky, arrowing toward a single target, the USS Gerald R. 100,000 tons of American maritime dominance, worth $13.5 billion, now stood in the crosshairs. This was no warning shot. It was a declaration, a direct challenge to the U.S. Navy's hold over one of the Pacific's most critical sea lanes. Inside the Ford's Combat Information Center, red lights flashed, sirens wailed, and radar screens bloomed with hostile signatures. In that moment, every sailor aboard knew the truth. The first direct carrier strike of the 21st century had begun. The first blast came without warning. At 4:16 a.m., a deafening roar ripped through the darkness as two explosions shook the USS Gerald R. One YJ-21E hypersonic missile detonated just 90 yards off the port bow, the shock wave hammering the carrier's steel hull like a sledge. A low-flying drone, weaving just above the waves, self-destructed mid-approach, scattering shards of metal across the churning sea. There was no hull breach, no fire, no casualty report flashing across the comms. But the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a drill, not a probing feint, but an open act of war. For the first time in more than 4 decades, a United States aircraft carrier was under direct enemy fire. Inside the Combat Information Center, the red glow of emergency lights cast long shadows across focused faces. Radar scopes lit up with hostile signatures, some streaking in from high altitude, others skimming low like predatory ghosts. Every operator moved with calculated precision, voices clipped and calm, the weight of the moment pressing against every heartbeat. The attack's opening phase lasted only 92 seconds, but in those moments the balance of power in the Pacific shifted. Years of Chinese posturing had culminated in a brazen strike aimed not at symbolic targets, but at the beating heart of U.S. naval projection. Out on the open sea, the Ford's escorts pivoted into battle formation, sensors locked on the incoming swarm. On the carrier's deck, sailors in fireproof gear stood ready at emergency stations, eyes tracking the dark horizon. They knew more was coming. The first wave was only the beginning. Somewhere beyond the black water, Liu Yang01 maneuvered under the shadow of its own drones, watching for weakness. But aboard the Ford, there was no fear, only the readiness that comes from years of drills, discipline, and doctrine. The enemy had struck first, but the fight was far from over. The USS Gerald R. did not flinch. In the black waters of the Philippine Sea, her defense network came alive, not in panic, but in flawless sequence, layer by layer, wall by wall. The outer ring struck first. At the edge of the carrier's escort screen, the guided missile destroyer USS Thomas Hudner locked onto the incoming hypersonic threat. In less than 14 seconds, 5 SIM-6 interceptors streaked upward in spiraling trails of flame. 3 enemy YJ-21E missiles were ripped apart at 41,000 feet, silent blossoms of fire and shrapnel high above the ocean. The other 2 streaked onward, but they would never make it through the second ring. The mid-layer ignited. From the Ford's own vertical launch tubes, pairs of evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, ESSM, screamed into the night. Their targets, electronic warfare drones flying just above sea level, weaving erratically to confuse tracking systems. The sky lit with orange flares as 8 UAVs were intercepted mid-turn, exploding into tumbling wreckage that splashed into the waves below. One particularly daring drone skimmed at just 19 feet above the surface, slipping through the first salvo before a final ESSM caught it and vaporized it in a brilliant flash. Then came the last wall. At point-blank range, the carrier's close-in weapon systems, CIWS, roared to life. Twin 6-barreled Gatling guns spun at blinding speed, spewing 4,500 tungsten rounds per minute. The sea air turned into a curtain of fire. One drone, undetected until the last possible second, knifed through the chaos at over 400 miles per hour, only to be shredded 210 yards from the flight deck. The resulting explosion rattled bolts in the steel, but the ship held steady. In total, 33 aerial threats, missiles and drones had entered the Ford's kill zone. Every one of them was neutralized. There were no hull breaches, no fires, no American dead. Not a single aircraft was lost. This was not luck. This was design. Each layer, from destroyer to missile to Gatling gun, worked in perfect choreography. Years of drills, joint exercises, and integrated combat systems had paid off in seconds. The message was unmistakable. An attack on a U.S. carrier would not be met with chaos, but with a measured, precise, and unstoppable defense. Somewhere out beyond the Ford's defensive ring, Liu Yang01 still lurked. But if her commanders had hoped to cripple America's flagship, the reality was now painfully clear. The storm had broken against a fortress that could fight back. 7 minutes after the last interceptor had roared skyward, the USS Gerald R shifted from defense to offense. The command deck moved with quiet purpose, every action deliberate, every order precise. High above, a Northrop Grumman E-2D Hawkeye banked hard into a wide orbit, climbing to 32,000 feet. Its rotating radar dish swept the sky like a silent sentinel, stitching the fragmented battlespace back together. Within 90 seconds, the electromagnetic fog that had blinded the fleet began to dissolve. Broken drone debris fell into the waves, enemy jamming signals faded, and the picture became clear. The source of the attack wasn't deep within mainland China. It was mobile, and it was close. The Chinese aircraft carrier Liu Yang01 was identified just 217 nautical miles southeast of Taiwan, repositioning after its first audacious strike. The response was immediate. 2 EA-18G Growlers, already airborne, banked southward into the designated corridor. Their mission? Electromagnetic retaliation. The Growlers unleashed concentrated pulses of jamming energy on the exact frequencies the Chinese drones had used minutes earlier. The effect was decisive. 6 hostile UAVs still circling the battlespace suddenly lost all contact with their operators. One by one, they spiraled helplessly downward, slamming into the sea as dead metal. In the Combat Information Center, Commander Rachel Dean, head of electronic warfare, watched Liu Yang01's radar signature flicker and reappear on the operations board, a target that had been cloaked now exposed. Her assessment was cold and direct. They wanted us blind. They wanted us hit. They failed. The initiative had shifted. The enemy's advantage was gone. And somewhere in the Pacific silence, America's counterstrike was already being set in motion. Real-time intelligence streamed in from U.S. Navy satellites and MQ-4 Sea Triton surveillance drones. The verdict was indisputable. Liu Yang01 had just executed the first carrier-to-carrier strike of the 21st century and was now retreating into contested waters. For the Pentagon, this was not merely a hostile act. It was war. Orders moved swiftly through the chain of command. At a classified forward base in Guam, 4 B-1B Lancer bombers stood ready. Each carried 8 AGM-183 ARRW Hypersonic glide missiles, Mach 7 weapons designed for pinpoint devastation. At 11:20 a.m., the Lancers lifted off under strict radio silence, refueling mid-air with KC-46 Pegasus tankers before curving into a long, deceptive arc to avoid early detection. Their mission was not symbolic, it was surgical, to cripple Liu Yang01 beyond recovery. In the skies over the Western Pacific, their escorts, EA-18G Growlers, formed an invisible shield of electronic warfare, jamming any hostile radar that might pierce the mission's stealth. Meanwhile, deep in the Philippine Sea, the Gerald R. Ford's combat team tracked every movement of their prey. The stage was set. The Chinese carrier that had dared to fire first was now a marked target, and when the strike came, it would be fast, merciless, and final. Skimming just 400 feet above the Pacific, an MQ-25 Stingray stealth drone slipped through sea clutter, invisible to conventional radar. 43 miles from its target, it gathered final telemetry. Liu Yang01's exact heat signature, deck orientation, and most importantly, the location of its ammunition magazine deep below deck. Without breaking radio silence, it transmitted the data to the incoming strike package, then vanished. At 14:41:32, two B-1B Lancers released their first ARRW hypersonic glide missiles. Accelerating to over Mach 7, they arced down from the upper atmosphere, invisible to standard tracking. 5 seconds later, the second salvo followed. Chinese defenses scrambled, but the reaction came too late. At 14:42:17, the first missile slammed into the forward mid-deck, detonating beneath the arrestor cable lines. The second struck just 6 meters from the marked ammunition storage. The blast chain reacted through the ship's munitions, sending shock waves ripping from bow to stern. Within minutes, flames engulfed the 75,000-ton vessel. Surveillance from a US P-8 Poseidon captured the detonation, a column of fire over 600 feet high, followed by 3 secondary explosions. One blast tore a flight elevator completely free, hurling it into the sea like a twisted coin. By 14:56, Liu Yang01 was listing heavily to starboard. At 15:01, it was half submerged. 6 minutes later, it slipped beneath the surface, disappearing into 19,000 feet of salt water. On the USS Gerald R forward, there were no cheers, no triumphant shouts. In the Combat Information Center, the final assessment came in. Target neutralized. No counterlaunch detected. No survivors confirmed. Rear Admiral Marcus Vance gave the only order needed. Mission complete. Broadcast nothing. Across the Indo-Pacific, command centers fell silent. The message required no headline, no press release. The most powerful ship in the Chinese Navy had been erased in less than 18 minutes, proof that striking a US carrier meant inviting annihilation. Across the Indo-Pacific, radar screens told the same story. The massive radar return of Liu Yang01 had vanished. Where the Chinese carrier once cut through the Philippine Sea, there was now only drifting debris and a widening oil slick. In Beijing, state media fell silent. For 72 hours, no official acknowledgement was made. Instead, archival footage of Chinese naval drills played on loop, while censors scrubbed the internet with surgical precision. Over 36,000 posts erased in the first 6 hours. The phrase Liu Yang01 became unsearchable, as if the carrier had never existed. The truth, however, was undeniable to those who had seen it firsthand. Naval observers from Japan, Australia, and the United Kingdom, already embedded with US Pacific Command, confirmed the strike's results in real time. In Tokyo, the Joint Defense Council described it as a demonstration of unmatched operational tempo. At the Pentagon, the mood was calm, almost clinical. There was no gloating, no theatrics. Rear Admiral Marcus Vance summarized the engagement in a closed-door debrief. They tested our resolve. They gambled everything on a first strike. We answered with precision, with discipline, without panic, without rhetoric. The message resonated far beyond the Western Pacific. In capitals across the globe, from Moscow to Pyongyang, from Tehran to Beijing, military planners studied the events of July 18th with quiet intensity. The strike had not only erased a warship, it had redrawn the boundaries of deterrence. For America's allies, the lesson was one of reassurance. U.S. carriers were not just symbols. They were active, layered fortresses capable of surviving and striking back under the harshest conditions. For adversaries, the warning was blunt and unmistakable. A challenge to U.S. naval supremacy would be met with overwhelming force, executed in minutes, and broadcast to the world not through press conferences, but through results. The destruction of Liu Yang01 was not simply a triumph of firepower. It was the product of an entire warfighting architecture operating in flawless harmony. From the moment the first hostile blips appeared on radar, every element of America's multi-domain arsenal moved as one. Surface combatants, carrier-borne aircraft, space-based surveillance, cyber and electronic warfare assets, and precision strike platforms. Sea, air, space, and cyberspace fused into a single, decisive response. It was proof that U.S. dominance is not declared, it is demonstrated. No speeches, no bluster, just disciplined execution under pressure. The USS Gerald R Ford had been built as a symbol of American maritime supremacy. On July 18, 2025, it became a living demonstration of that supremacy in action. In the days that followed, U.S. carrier strike groups repositioned across the Western Pacific. From Okinawa to Guam to Diego Garcia, readiness levels rose, patrol arcs shifted, and watch rotations tightened. There was no need for threats or ultimatums. The deployment patterns themselves spoke volumes. Allies understood without being told. America was not simply reacting, it was shaping the battle space for whatever might come next. For adversaries watching in silence, from the hills of Tehran to the bunkers of Pyongyang, from ministries in Moscow to naval headquarters along the Chinese coast, the message could not be missed. You do not strike a U.S. carrier and walk away. You do not challenge the balance of power and expect it to remain intact. The United States does not merely defend the sea, it writes its rules. Perhaps the most potent symbol of the engagement was what did not happen afterward. No press conference, no boasting headlines, no parade of victory speeches. Rear Admiral Marcus Vance's final order from the Combat Information Center, mission complete, broadcast nothing, was carried out to the letter. In the stillness that followed, silence became the sharpest weapon of all. For years, China had sought to project its maritime ambitions through steel, ceremony, and the symbolism of ships like Liu Yang01. That carrier was meant to be a statement, a floating declaration that the era of uncontested U.S. dominance in the Pacific was over. Instead, in less than 18 minutes, it was reduced to sonar echoes beneath 19,000 feet of saltwater. The lesson was clear: preparation beats provocation. Every operator, every radar tech, every pilot and gunner had performed in perfect synchrony, not because of luck, but because the system was built to work under pressure. This was a victory of doctrine as much as of weapons, a layered architecture of readiness, coordination, and unity. For the American people, most of whom will never stand on a carrier deck or hear the thunder of a CIWS, this battle was a reminder: your defenders are not waiting to react, they are preparing to prevent. And if tested, they will act without hesitation, without chaos, and without warning. When the horizon returned to silence, it was still the Stars and Stripes standing watch. That is not just deterrence, that is the American difference.